All right, hello everyone. Let's get on to our next story here about the ruthless Assyrians, and the Neo-Babylonians, who were part of the Babylonian Captivity, of course. This is going to be a short lecture, but pretty interesting, and it's just kind of the continuation from after the Dark Age, right? We talked about that period of time of the Dark Ages in the previous lecture. The early Dark Ages around 1100 BC, 1200 to 1100 BC, and then all these new civilizations kind of appear. The ancient Hebrews, we talked about them, and then the Assyrians and the Babylonians in this lecture, and then from there we're going to talk about the Persians in the next lecture. All right, so what do we know about these ancient Assyrians? Let's get going. And so the first thing about the ancient Assyrians, just a few really basic things. Again, this is the wide map of all the civilizations we're covering in the Dark Age period, is they're located right up here, their capital, a city called Nineveh, right there, first key word there. And that's going to be the capital of the ancient Assyrians, so in northern Mesopotamia. They're going to conquer and control much of Mesopotamia. We also know from the previous lecture they're going to take over the northern tribes of that kingdom of Israel, remember? So we had the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, and so those 10 tribes in the north are going to be displaced by the Assyrians. So I kind of mentioned that in the previous lecture. And then from about 900 to 600 BC, the Assyrians will be the dominant power in Mesopotamia. And there's really just three things I want you to know about them. What are these kind of three key things I want you to know about the Assyrians? Number one, they are very militaristic. And what I mean by that, they had advanced military for their time, very well trained, better infantry, better soldiers, cavalry. One of the interesting points I read about once is they actually had military engineers with them that they would take on a military campaign. And this military engineer would maybe get to a wall or something, for example. They would know, did you dig underneath, or do you build some sort of siege equipment? And so the Assyrians had a fairly strong military, and they were very effective using this military to control much of Mesopotamia, and as I said, also conquer that kingdom of Israel. So then the question is, all right, we know they're strong, we know they had a strong military. Why weren't they able to hold on to it much longer than what they did? And they're going to have other civilizations coming in and so forth. But one key element as well is just how ruthless the Assyrians often were. And this is good for history. If we find sources by people who were conquered by the Assyrians, and the people who were conquered by the Assyrians go, man, the Assyrians were mean, nasty people. Well, of course you were conquered by the Assyrians. It's not much of a statement. But what if we have sources from the Assyrians themselves describing themselves as mean and ruthless? And that's, a lot more relevant, right? And we do. We have Assyrian law codes, which I put in my readers for my students, right? In the History 110 class and the History of the Middle East class, you have these sources of Assyrian codes. And the Assyrian law codes are brutal. And you say, well, so like the Code of Hammurabi, that was brutal. We covered that earlier. But the Assyrians are much more of a torturous type of punishments. And you can kind of see that if you want to take the time and look at their law codes, you would find that. Another thing is what we hear from Assyrian kings. So let me just read to you a short little few sentences here from an Assyrian king who conquered his enemies and what he says to do. So this is, you don't need to worry about the specific king, but just listen to the explanation here. He says, I tore out the tongues of those whose slanderous mouths had uttered blasphemies against me. I defeated them completely. I smashed them alive. He goes on and says, I fed their corpses cut into small pieces to dogs, pigs, zebu birds, vultures, birds in the sky, and the fish of the ocean. And he kind of goes on. So this is from the Assyrians themselves. And so, if you treat enough people this way, sooner or later, people are going to get upset. And so, this is one issue that we see with the Assyrians is they were very ruthless. So we know they were militaristic, we know they were ruthless, but we also know they developed art, and they had art as well, and specifically what we call kind of bas-relief art, and I'm just going to show you an image of it here in the next slide. And so this is Assyrian art. It's, kind of raised. I think that's the best way to describe it. So imagine it's kind of a flat surface and the art itself is raised. So the style is bas-relief. And in the Assyrians one, look at what you see here. I mean, this is kind of goes back to their militaristic ways, right? You see weapons, you see this guy's like wrestling a lion up here, folks, right? And so you see the horses and the cavalry and so forth. So even in their art, you see their brutality. So those are the only real three major things I want you to know about the Assyrians for my class, right? So they're militaristic, just know where they are, run roughly, definitely know about their art, know about their how they treated people, and then what eventually happens is we move to closer to about 600 BC, we're going to see the emergence of the Neo-Babylonians. And so let me just briefly talk about the Neo-Babylonians as well in this lecture, and then we'll do the Persians in our next one. So I just have one slide here for you on the Babylonians and the Neo-Babylonians. And again, Babylon further south. So if remember, we started from Jerusalem, previous lecture. Now we're at the Assyrians, and now down here, the Babylonians in the city of Babylon. They're basically going to dominate Mesopotamia, but not for that long, maybe for about 100 years or so. There's really only one major thing I want you to know about the Babylonians for this course, and that is the Babylonian Captivity. So this takes place around the year 580 BC. And if you remember when we talked about the kingdom of Israel and how it divided, and we talked about the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Well, it will be the Babylonians under the king Nebuchadnezzar II. And yes, I've seen his name spelled more than one way, as you can imagine. Nebuchadnezzar II, he will capture the Jewish people. He will defeat the kingdom of Judah. They will capture the Jewish people and bring about what is called the Babylonian captivity, when roughly maybe 100 to 125,000 of the Jewish inhabitants will be taken to Babylon and imprisoned there. And they're going to stay there for a while, and you'll see what happens to them in our next lecture. But that's pretty significant in terms of seeing what happened to the Jewish people there. We also know we get the destruction of Solomon's temple, and a lot of kind of accounts do say this happened during the Babylonian captivity, although I've read other accounts that say maybe it happened a little bit later and so forth, but so the exact dates of it are historically sometimes disputed. But we do see kind of that destruction of Solomon's temple, which then again will rebuild and then will be destroyed by the Romans. The second destruction is pretty much we know exactly when that happened. There's a much better documentation for that. But definitely we see this happening with the Babylonians. So that's it. That's all you need to know about them. Not much, right? And so we're seeing the continuing kind of civilization post-Dark Age. And while the Hebrews, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians all had their little chance to kind of have a little bit of real estate, we're going to see the next civilization, the ancient Persians, are going to do something no one has done up to this point yet. And that's going to be what we're going to cover in our very next lecture here. All right, thank you.